Our next speaker is Dr. Phil Fisher, who's the Knight Professor, Knight Chair and Professor of Psychology at University of Oregon, and is a Senior Fellow at the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, and has spent a lifetime translating science into practical interventions. And Phil, that's why you're here, so welcome.
Thank you, Pat. A lifetime, that means I would have started when I was a child, which is not true, but I have been doing it for a long time.
You would have started prenatally, Phil.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and it's a pleasure to follow Fernando. I think I have my work cut out for me, but in terms of connecting his talk to mine, there's a lot I think that can be derived from what he was saying in terms of how this should apply then to our efforts to try to improve outcomes in context in which there are health inequities, and really our need to move beyond the kind of status quo that our field has been at in terms of early childhood intervention. So that's really what the focus of my talk is going to be upon. As Pat mentioned, this work emanates really from two different sources: the University of Oregon, where my lab is based, but also the work that's gone on in the synthesis and translation of science at the Center on the Developing Child. I have a number of public and private funders that have supported this work as well. In terms of kind of the current state of the field when it comes to addressing health inequities through programs, intervention programs, evidence-based practices focusing on early childhood, I really want to start with this idea that it is truly a half empty, half full kind of a scenario. And I think it's really important in any talk about this topic to first celebrate the half full. 50 years ago, we had really no idea whether it was possible systematically to address health inequities through intervention programs. In the intervening time, it's been possible to develop a scientific knowledge base that suggests that outcomes can be improved in spite of individuals facing structural contexts that make it that pose a number of challenges and hurdles, as Dr. Braveman was saying. And there has actually been a fair amount of progress in scaling efforts that are relatively well understood to make a positive impact. Those, as an intervention developer and evaluator, are no small things, especially in the context of high adversity settings. It's not straightforward to develop that evidence base. At the same time, if you look at the progress that's been made in terms of the impact of programs in early childhood over the past 50 years, there's actually a relatively limited amount of progress in terms of the impact or effect size of programs that have been evaluated. This is from a meta-analytic study that was done by Greg Duncan and Catherine Magnuson, and it evaluated all of the early childhood education programs that had been published over the past 50 years that met certain criteria, including having a reasonable group size and using randomization. And what you can see is that starting in the 1960s with kind of the seminal programs like Perry Preschool and Abecedarian, that the effect sizes of these programs has actually decreased somewhat over time. That may be an artifact of the fact that the counterfactual has increased. That is, people are getting more quality supports even when they're not in these programs. Nevertheless, the effect sizes are quite modest, and if you look at the actual impact on individuals of a modest effect size program, you're not really necessarily having the desired impact on the sort of population level outcomes that you might be interested in. It's pretty straightforward to diagnose what the problem is. One of the biggest issues is that the methodologies that we've evaluated interventions from has focused on central tendency. That is, we look at means, and we typically say in the context of randomized evaluation trials that an intervention is successful if we can see a change in the mean overall. But what we aren't doing is going beyond that. Again, a mean change is wonderful, and we should be very excited about it. But there's a tremendous amount of information that's typically overlooked when we look at intervention outcomes. And that is, why is it that some individuals respond quite well to our programs, but others don't respond and fail to respond? And typically, and again, this is something that we all have done who have had intervention trials, we celebrate the changes that we see. They're not that easy to detect. When we find them, we're very pleased, and those are what gets published. But what we don't do very often is look and segment the sample to understand better who are the individuals who are not responding and what we might be able to do. And when we do that, our analyses are almost always post hoc, and they often focus on things that are, I wouldn't say superficial, but not necessarily malleable, like gender or the location of where a particular group received services. This is not necessarily something that needs to be the status quo. The reality is that we have gotten, we really have traditions in research methodology have existed for a very long time. In addition to the issue of kind of looking too much at central tendency, the other issue that it really plagues our early childhood programs is a lack of specificity and precision in what we do. We develop these programs that are kind of kitchen sink models. We do everything that we possibly can. We provide services to children. We provide services to families in the classroom, in the home. Why do we do this? Well, partially the ecology of the funding landscape makes it so that it's hard to get funds to evaluate programs. Obviously, finding positive effects is incentivized, and it takes a long time to develop the knowledge base. But what it means is that we kind of load up on and put our eggs in the basket of we're going to try to maximize the likelihood that something will change across time rather than having levels of specificity and precision that we need. As I said, this is not necessarily the way things need to go. Dating back to the 1750s, when James Lind did his first studies of treatment of scurvy on British sailing vessels, we've known that it's possible to be very precise in the way that we evaluate programs. James Lind was a Royal British naval surgeon, and what he did in this classic experiment was to go out on a sailing vessel, wait for sailors to develop symptoms of scurvy, and then assigned each 12 individuals to 6 groups of 2 each, and these were the various treatments that he tried that were based on kind of folk remedies of the day: a quart of cider, 6 spoonfuls of vinegar, half pint of seawater, 25 drops of this vile elixir of vitriol, which was sulfuric acid dissolved in water, a spicy paste, plus a drink of barley water, or 2 oranges and a lemon. And of course, everybody knows now that the treatment with the citrus fruit was the one that had the greatest impact. And later went on to, and it actually took him quite some time to figure out that it was actually the substance in the lemons and citrus fruit that were responsible for eliminating the symptoms of scurvy. 250 years later, when we look at early childhood programs, we do not have that kind of specificity and precision. It's almost as if what we've done is to dump all of the ingredients that James Lind put into his clinical trial into most of our intervention programs. And then not only are we not really that clear about what the active ingredients are, but we also are just as happy to celebrate when something else happens, like the ship comes back and fewer people have lost limbs or fewer people have drowned. Those things are considered successes as well. What's missing in this equation is the a priori ability to determine what it is that we're trying to do and whether the things that we're specifically targeting have a direct impact on outcomes of interest. But again, that's not really something that's new to the field. It doesn't need to be reinvented. It just is something that requires us to have to take extra steps to be able to get there. When it comes to early childhood, and again, this is work from the Center on the Developing Child, it's not necessarily the case that we need to spend the next 50 years coming up with effective strategies to intervene to impact outcomes. There are a lot in the existing programs that we understand to be efficacious. Some have to do with effective strategies for supporting caregivers. Some have to do with effective strategies for promoting learning in children, increasingly understanding effective strategies for addressing health issues as well as cognitive and learning kinds of outcomes. One thing that's, I think, extremely helpful is to think about what are the kind of core principles. If you were to try to distill down, what are the active ingredients in effective programs? What we see consistently in the science is that a lot of these programs are founded on one or more of these three core principles. One, and again, this comes from decades of research in developmental psychology and other areas of science. One is to support responsive relationships between adults and children. And adult caregivers doesn't necessarily just mean parents, but other significant individuals in the child's life. The second is to strengthen core life skills, specifically, and this is where the field has become increasingly occupied, rightly so, with the idea of social and emotional development, which is really critical for any individual to be successful and prosperous in today's world. And the third is, and we heard about this now in both talks, and I expect we'll continue to reduce sources of stress in children's lives, in particular, the kinds of stress that create chronic activation of the biological stress response system, which in the context of not having a supportive adult present is what leads to the kind of phenomenon of so-called toxic stress with lifelong consequences. It's really in these three categories of activities. So I'm sort of suggesting we need to move to a slightly more agnostic perspective on it's not this program or that program that's evidence-based that is going to make the difference, but what are the active ingredients and how much can you distill them into these three domains in terms of the kinds of impacts that we want to have. One of the things that I think is also extremely critical is that these particular focal areas are important not only for supporting children's development, but they also play an extremely central role in adult well-being. And they're things that adults need as well to be successful and effective. So how do we put these together in terms of a process for moving forward? First of all, and these are just some fairly, again, straightforward recommendations, they fall within a process model that we've developed in Oregon and at the center at Harvard for facilitating the field moving forward in its current context by taking the best of what's there, but also by creating structures that facilitate things not kind of flowing towards the status quo. The first thing that we have to do that's just sort of a non-starter if we don't, is we have to start thinking about clinical trials as experimental tests of theory. That is, we can't simply do intervention studies, measure a whole raft of outcomes and say, well, something on average changed, so my program's now evidence-based, and it's now the next one in line to be scaled or on the best practices list. That will perpetuate the status quo. It'll keep things exactly as they are. On the other hand, if you can identify specifically what the active ingredients, that is what it is that your program is designed to change directly, and you can determine whether that's changing or not, and whether in the context of randomized assignment, whether those changes are associated with specific outcomes of interest, child learning, child health, reductions in obesity and BMI, then you have, in the context of that intervention, not only something that works, but you also have support for the idea that these are specific causal mechanisms driving outcomes and should be targeted. So we have to leverage clinical trials as experimental tests of theory. We have to look at not only mediators, that is, what are the things that are changing, that are the underlying mechanisms of the intervention, but we just have to become obsessed with moderators. The idea that we're only looking at average effects is simply not going to get us as far as we need to get. What we need to understand is the for whom part of the equation. That is, in any particular intervention trial or any time when we're measuring outcomes, there are going to be variations around the mean. And we need to understand that it's not just a random variation around the mean. We need to understand what are the variables that are most predictive of whether individuals benefit or fail to benefit from the programs that we have available. Some of those may be environmental factors. Some of them may be the interplay of genes and environment and variations in how susceptible individuals are to certain kinds of experiences. But we need to pay attention to those moderators. We also need to just really, and I think for anybody that's from a federal funding agency, this is particularly important, and anybody that comes from philanthropic background that supports this work. Large-scale RCTs are certainly important and have a place in the development of the scientific knowledge base, but we don't really need another generation of new interventions that target the same things that we've been targeting historically. We have plenty of them. They work pretty well. We know, generally speaking, that we can get children to increase their vocabulary. We're not great at it, but we could get better. We know various ways to improve health and well-being. The issue is that our progress is really glacial in terms of the way in which knowledge develops. Instead, there are plenty of opportunities in the context of research practice partnerships to take the knowledge that exists and through a rapid cycle process to understand much better what can be done to drive better outcomes for those who are less responsive to programs, and to use things like adaptive designs and idiographic methodologies that look more at a lot of high-density observations within individual trajectories to see how things are changing. So I think all of these are tools within this framework that can be extremely helpful in propelling the field forward. And again, these are not to supplant large-scale RCTs, but we need to be able to augment those in order to drive interventions into a different place. And really, I guess part of what I'm suggesting is that I don't believe that a single intervention is going to somehow appear on the landscape that has a whopping effect size relative to anything that we've seen thus far. And I think what we do is continue to invest our funding resources in new studies that are sort of promising that that's going to be the case, instead of trying to understand how to segment the population and become more precise about who needs what. Finally, I think that translational neuroscience can play a huge role in this because so much of the work in terms of understanding how responsive relationships buffer the individual from the effects of stress, how stress does get under the skin and impact early learning, gives us some very clear ideas about precise targets that we might want to focus on in the context of our intervention trials to not necessarily increase the impact, but to increase the efficiency and therefore reduce the resources necessary to actually move the needle in particular directions. I want to give you just a brief example of this before I close. We developed a video coaching approach for supporting responsive caregiving. It's equally well adapted for use in childcare settings as it is in the context of parent-child relationships in the home. And what it involves is filming children and their caregivers in the natural environment and then extracting out of the film instances of what the Harvard Center calls serve and return, where the child does something in exploring their world and the adult responds in kind to the child and the interaction goes back and forth. The sum total of the intervention is to extract brief clips and break them down kind of like the way you see in sports into more of a play-by-play. First the child does this, then you do that. And that narration, which is designed to be highly scalable and be able to be delivered by pretty much anybody in community settings, is what we show in the context of this intervention. In the context of using a very precise approach like this, where we're showing people naturalistically what they're already doing to support their child's development, that the science for decades has shown is what's necessary. What we've done now is to start looking at the potential impact on underlying caregiver brain mechanisms that we think are critical to healthy child development. And in particular, one of the things that we've noticed, we did this in a small RCT, looking at parents' inhibitory control just in response to a basic computer task before and after the intervention. And what we saw was that parents given 10 sessions of this video coaching, where what they're really doing is looking at themselves interacting with their child, show enhanced physical self-control on this computer task after versus before the intervention relative to a control group. And concordantly, we see changes in activation of motor regions in the brain for women who receive this intervention relative to those who don't. The reason that I put this example up there is that this is not a rocket science kind of an intervention. This is simply a strength-based intervention that shows people what they're already doing, does not teach new skills, is not deficit-based. It just says, here you are already supporting your child. And in the context of that, we see changes in this one key area that the research is showing is really critical for both children and adults to be successful. So this is an example of how this kind of neuroscience-driven approach for targeting underlying mechanisms can be really influential. But again, this is but one piece of the puzzle. This is not, therefore, the answer to everything. This is a piece that can add to the knowledge base and really drive things forward in the field of early childhood. Thanks.